Julian Fellowes is the writer, creator, and executive producer of The Gilded Age, now in its second season on HBO. I'm David Buchanan with Gold Derby. Julian, I wanted to start, obviously, with the big arc of season 2, which are the Opera Wars, which is a real kind of historical battle that took place between the Met and the Academy of Music. What about that history most fascinated you that you said, I have to include this as the main arc for season 2?
Well, I was sort of looking through 1883 events, and scandals and gossip and political stuff and so on. And I came upon this extraordinary fact of the Opera War, which, initially I thought, can it be true that they opened on the same night and with preventing the whole of New York going to both, which is what would have happened. And also what I liked very much was that the central battle, if you like, was because the old money that supported the Academy thought they were strong enough to keep out the new people. And of course, they weren't. And in the end, money talks. And the new people were not only just rich. I don't want to give that impression. The new people discovered a kind of sense of American identity that was very much stronger than what had happened before the Civil War, when a lot of, particularly among the upper and upper middle classes, a lot of it was borrowed from Europe and was sort of modeled on Europe and all the rest of it. But these new people, during those years, made these enormous fortunes. They didn't want to be told how to do this or how they should arrange their dinner party. At the end of that, they wanted to have their own American society. And really, the battle between the Met and the Academy, for me, kind of embodied that struggle, that they thought they could keep out modernity. I mean, in many ways, I think around this period is when you see the beginning of modern America and things we could still recognize. I mean, when I see Elon Musk, having a rocket race with someone, I think this is exactly the kind of thing they would have done in the Gilded Age if they'd had rockets. And I loved that. And that was really, I suppose, why I went with it. And of course, opera is very glamorous as well. It's a wonderfully visual expression of their power and their money and their determination. You have this extraordinary auditorium. Actually, for me, you'll probably disagree, but it made me rather sad that New York had decided to pull down their original opera house. In Paris, in London, in Milan, pretty well everywhere else, they restored the great opera house of the late 19th century, but New York flattened it. And I think it was a shame.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't disagree with that at all. And I think what you're touching on in terms of old money, new money class really comes through as well in the kind of other storyline for the Russells, George and Bertha, and George's kind of struggle against his union workers in Pittsburgh. That was such a magnetic story this season and so well performed. And I just wanted to ask you how tricky it is as a writer when your protagonist, George Russell, is a robber baron and has to be as ruthless as some of those others like Jay Gould, the historical figures, but also keep him, human and somebody that the audience identifies with and wants to root for, and obviously has to do, make some concessions to make him, more of a kind of agreeable character. So what was it like navigating that balance as a writer?
Well, a key to me was when I was reading a book about Jay Gould, who I'm sure you know is one of the main robber barons of all and one of the richest people ever to live on earth, given, the inflation and everything. And as I was reading it, I came upon the very surprising contrast that he was so ruthless in business that even Mrs. Astor wouldn't have anything to do with him. He was just implacable, unstoppable. But he was a very tender husband and a very affectionate parent. And he would be leading his little daughter round the garden on a leading rein where she was balancing on her pony. And this is an era when most rich fathers couldn't pick out their own children in a lineup. And he really adored his children. And as I was reading it, I thought, this is a marvelous combination for a fictional character, because that will give me exactly what you're talking about, is a human dimension to George, who is not a bad parent at all, coupled with his determination to be the richest and most powerful man in the world. And that was the double that was lodged within the breast of Jay Gould. So I really took to that, and that was what I used. Really, I think people are full of contradictions. You know, often in fiction, people are sort of all bad or all good or whatever it is, but very seldom in life. And on the whole, most of us are a pretty good ragbag of contradictory emotions. And I felt that would work for George.
Absolutely. Another arc this season, so many wonderful characters and storylines, is Peggy with her time at the paper, and especially her trip to the South, which is harrowing and illuminating for her and probably for the audience too. What was so important about sending Peggy to the South where she hasn't been before, and, you know, kind of experiencing something very traumatic? How does that change the character, not just for the rest of this season, but looking forward in her trajectory in future years?
Well, again, a book as part of my research that influenced me in all this was called Black Gotham. And it was about the Black middle class in New York in the sort of second half of the 19th century, which was quite substantial. I was fascinated by this because I'd hardly known that this group, this community existed. But of course, they were essentially very sheltered. Until the end of slavery, most slaves were slaves, and they were not roaming free and coming up to New York because they preferred to live there. They had no rights of their own. They were just trampled. And then the Civil War came, and suddenly free mobility began to be a reality. Of course, as I'm sure you know, it wasn't long before the Jim Crow laws tried to start restricting the new freedoms. And suddenly you couldn't get in this railway carriage, and you couldn't do this, and you couldn't do that. But right at the beginning, for the first years after the Civil War, there was much more freedom. And really, the world of a bourgeois Black American living in New York in 1880 was entirely different from the ex-slaves in the South and their children, who were still living with a level of oppression that was actually only going to get worse as the century wore on. And it seemed to me that it was important that Peggy should understand what everyone was talking about, that her father is an ex-slave, and all her life she's heard this 1,000 times, but she hasn't really grasped it. She doesn't really know what people are talking about. And her mother tries to warn her about the danger and the fear and all the rest of it. But I felt she had to see it for herself. She had to experience it to know that everyone wasn't exaggerating. And, you know, and you get this, I mean, it was extraordinary what was still going on, you know, right through. I mean, I remember, which you certainly don't, when, you know, the famous woman wouldn't get off the bus and be moved, and it all began. And that was in the middle 60s. And that was really the beginning of the Great Movement. But till then, right through the war, I mean, I think the war changed things a bit, but they didn't really change until even later than that. And you know, I feel part of my job. I mean, of course, part of my job is to make people cry and laugh. I do know that. But part of it is to give them information about what's gone on, which they may have got a kind of cursory idea about, but they've never really gone into it. And that seemed to me an important job for the show, really.
Let's talk about another arc in which you definitely make audiences cry and laugh and feel joy. At the beginning is Ada's relationship with Luke. A lovely love story at the beginning of the season, and of course has a tragic end for Luke. I was wondering though, why, after the events of the first season, why did you feel like now was the right time to introduce not just a love interest for Ada, but such a deep and emotional one where not only do they fall in love, but they get married. And then of course we know, what happens from there.
I mean, it's all based on a real story, like a lot of my stuff is, because I remember how shocked I was when some people, my friends of my parents, got married and he died 6 months later. And it was astonishing. But I think the point I wanted to make is that to define for the audience that Ada is a three-dimensional character who has a fully developed emotional self, and that this was ignored by Agnes for most of the time, not actually denied, but ignored. But nevertheless, Ada has all the layers that are necessary to have a fulfilled heart. And I felt my message, if I'm allowed to suggest I send messages, is that really Ada benefits from this. Of course, it's tragic, and he's dead, and that's terrible. But she has known the whole thing. She has been through the experience. And I think Agnes says at one point, she'll never be the same because of all this. And I suppose I believe that. I think that the emotional stories we all have to navigate in our own lives, whoever we are, they bring substance to our lives, and they bring layers to our personality that are, on the whole, valuable and worthwhile. And just because something is tragic doesn't mean it has no value. I suppose that's what I was saying.
Yeah, and we see that in many ways in the season finale. And I want to ask you some questions about that episode in terms of winning and losing, because that's your episode submitted for Emmy consideration this year. A wonderful conclusion to the season. And let's start with that arc between Agnes and Ada, because Luke, of course, yes, it's tragic, but he also saves that family from financial ruin, which is a really incredible reversal of fortune. What is most exciting to you when you were plotting this season, and also, having an eye towards the future, about this kind of role reversal between Agnes and Ada? Because you leave us with a tantalizing final scene where, there's a real shift in dynamic in that household.
Yes, because in the end, of course, Ada becomes the mechanism by which the household will continue to run. And Agnes has simply been transformed into a dependent. Something of which no one is more aware of than she. And I like that thing of when a role between human beings becomes established, becomes settled. Everyone knows how it is. They're the lucky ones, they're the rich ones, whatever it is. And then something changes the whole thing. And I'm always fascinated. I remember reading an interview when it was announced that Grace Kelly was going to marry Prince Rainier of Monaco. Of course, you're too young, but at the time, it was incredibly glamorous and exciting and romantic, and she was as beautiful as a goddess, and the whole thing in Monte Carlo in the south of France, it just had everything. And they interviewed her father, and all he could say was, I always thought Peggy was the one who had it on the nose. I thought it would be Peggy. And you realize that Grace Kelly, her whole life, had been overshadowed by this sister, who I'm sure was blameless. I'm sure it wasn't her fault, but had been overshadowed by the assumptions of her father, and for all I know, her family, and her own extraordinary, stellar magic was entirely overlooked. And that's something that appeals to me, that life changes things. And when you get old, you realize that people's expectations of life are often wholly different from what actually comes to pass. Sometimes it's much better, and sometimes it's not. But, it's like when I don't know if you were at drama school, But when you're at drama school, there's always 2 or 3 students in every class that everyone thinks are the ones. They almost never are. And the ones who come through, nobody really noticed. They were standing behind them when you were doing body movement or whatever it was, and nobody particularly clocked them. And then 10 years later, their name is in lights. And that's an aspect of life that I always enjoy, really.
Yeah, that's so apt for the dynamic between Agnes and Ada. Let's also talk about those last 15 or so minutes of that episode, which are so exciting. You know, seeing which of these opera houses, of course, we know which one in the long term, you know, has succeeded versus the other, but to watch that unfold and the tension of that final sequence is so exciting. Was there ever any question in your mind that Bertha would win this battle? Was there ever a thought that maybe this one she doesn't win and she'll, you know, come back stronger later? Was her victory always foretold in your mind?
My victory was foretold in my decision to put her behind the Met, because I don't believe Bertha, she might have wanted a box in the Academy. Indeed, she did, like a lot of them did. But the Academy made this incredibly short-sighted decision not to build more boxes and not to let any of the new people in. So my putting Bertha on the side of the Met would really have been, on the side of the Academy, would have been a denial of history, really. I mean, all of those families, those Vanderbilts and so on, they were all backing the Met. And of course, apart from anything else, they had limitless money. I mean, the Met's opening season practically earns itself in the Guinness Book of Records for the number of opera stars who were featured from the very beginning, because the money didn't matter. It didn't matter if it made a profit. Nobody cared. They just wanted it to be a huge success. And in a way, it was for me a kind of statement of the triumph of modernity over the past. And there seemed to me something optimistic and exciting and invigorating about that. And of course, I want Bertha to win. I mean, I know Bertha is not in any sense a yielding and innocent heroine. Bertha is a fighter. She, you know, doesn't quite have a sword and a shield, but she might as well. And she knows what she wants, and she's gonna get it. And that's what a lot of those women were like. I mean, the nearest in real life to Bertha is Alva Vanderbilt. And, you know, she, slightly different background. She came from a cotton-owning Southern family. And of course, the Civil War destroyed their fortune, and there was nothing left. So she was poor, but a little bit posher than Bertha. But, you know, and she was presented to the Empress of the French and all that sort of stuff. But that wasn't what she wanted. What she wanted was power, and she wanted money, and she knew she had to get money from the start. And she married Willie K. Vanderbilt and got it. And there's something about those women in a society that wasn't easy for women. These societies, whether you were posh or not or anything else, these societies did not offer a plethora of choices. They didn't offer careers. They offered, at the lower end, you know, domestic service and that kind of thing. At the upper end, they offered more or less nothing. Your only chance of having something worth getting out of bed for to do was to marry an ambassador, a congressman, a member of the government, you know, a great manufacturer. Yes, that did generate a role, and some of those women did it very well, but that's not the same as being offered a career. And, you know, they had to fight that. And when you were a woman and you were born with brains and ambition and determination, what did you do with it? And I suppose that's always rather fascinated me, really.
Julian, I think you've set up a really exciting third season. I know you're doing table reads of season 3 scripts right now. We can't wait to see it. Congratulations on an excellent season, second season of The Gilded Age. Thank you for talking to Gold Derby today.
No, well, thank you for inviting me. It's very kind.